This week we are covering input validation, and we're going to be using some string validation methods, and we're also going to be using some math methods. In addition to that, we are going to be taking a look at the modulus operator, because that will tell us if we divide two numbers, integers, and whether or not there is a remainder. That is what the modulus tells us. So we're going to be taking a look at all of those, and we're going to start with some of our string validation methods. The first one is null or empty. And the syntax for this is you have to use the keyword string and a dot, and then is null or empty. And this is case sensitive, so you'll notice that the first letter of each word is capitalized. And then you pass it the variable that you want to check, and it should be a string. And it's going to return a true if it is in fact null or empty. And it will return false if something is there. And then I've got a little program that tests this. So I've got string 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that string 1 actually has something there. Okay, string 2 has nothing, and string 3, null, is also nothing. Okay, so string 2 and 3 should fail our test, right? So it should return true because they are null or empty. Okay, so we create 3 Booleans, and we're storing the result of the test is null or empty. So for string 1 that has something there, it should be storing false. For string 2, which is empty, it should be storing true because it is null or empty. And string 3 is null. That should also store true because it is null or empty. And then just to verify what's in these Booleans, we print them out. And you can see that, in fact, the first one did test false and the other two are true. They are null or empty. And then we want to print out the valid string. Okay, so what we do is we check the Booleans. So we check the first one. So if it's not true, that means it is false. Okay, then print it, because it's going to be true if it's null or empty. It's going to be false if it's valid. So we're saying if it's false, print it. Okay, if the second one was false, print that. If the third one was false, print that. And we already know the first one was false, so it does get printed, but the other ones are true, so they do not get printed. Try parse. So what this does is it actually does a couple different things, okay? It creates an output variable in the data type that you specify, and it also returns a true or a false. So you can basically ignore that if you're using this to convert the output, but normally you would be checking that true or false to see if it actually worked or not. Did the conversion work? That's not really how our little interactive system is using it, but that is kind of the point. Anyway, so data type here can be integer, float, double, long, or decimal. And we use that data type dot try parse, which is similar to the data type dot parse. Okay. And then we pass it our string. And then we specify that we have an output variable using the keyword out. And then we give it the name of the output variable. So this variable has to be declared before we use try parse. Okay, because we declare it, and here is where we're going to put data in it. Okay, and then if this worked, our Boolean is going to indicate that it was successful. So let's take a look at how you set this up. You can see I've got an integer that I'm calling converted number, and I've got int.tryparse, and you can see that I'm kind of ignoring the Boolean that's been returned. And I'm passing it a string 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the output here is going to go into converted number. And just to show that, hey, that is actually now a number, I multiply it by 10 and I write it out. So the problem in doing it this way and not checking the Boolean is, we are assuming that tryparse worked. If it did not work, then we have a problem because int converted number isn't going to have anything in it. It's just going to take whatever value is in memory and use that value, probably not the value that we would want. And the program is going to have a runtime error. So a much safer approach is to check the Boolean. So how do we do that? So the safe way to do this, we still create converted number and we still use int.tryparse. And you'll notice we're still sending it that number string. We still have our output variable. The difference here is that we're taking the result that is returned, which is a true or a false, and we're storing it in a Boolean called success. And then before we do anything with converted number, we are checking success to see if it's true. So did this work? If it did, yeah, then we can go ahead and multiply that number by 10 and print it out. Now you might think, man, that is a lot of coding. Well, for those of you who like a little shortcut, you can take int.tryparse with its little parameter list, and you can put that inside of an if, because remember, it is returning true or false. And that is what the if statement is going to be looking at. So it will go ahead and do the conversion if it's true, okay? And if it's true, it's going to go through and execute the codes that are in the block. If it is false, it's not going to put something in converted number, but it's also not going to go through and execute the code. Okay, so this is just basically 3 different ways of achieving the same task. The second and third method, where you're actually checking the Boolean, is preferable and it is safer. So here I've got a program where the user enters input, and then the program determines if it is a number and whether or not the number can be printed out. So you can see in the if statement is where I've got that int.tryparse. Okay, so it is checking the Boolean here that gets returned to see if it is true or false. So it's checking to see if what they entered can be converted into an integer. And if that's true, we tell them, yep, your integer number is, and we tell them. Otherwise, we tell them, hey, can't convert this. And then we look at that same input, we try to convert it to float. If that's successful, then we say, yep, we converted it. Otherwise, we tell them no. We do the same thing with double, and we do the same thing with decimal. Okay, so just a little example of how you can use tryparse inside of an if statement. Okay, and here's the number. And that cannot be converted into an integer, but the other 3 types do support decimals, so it could be converted to those other types. Compare to. So what this does is it compares either 2 strings or 2 objects to see if they are the same. If they are the same, it returns a 0. Anything other than 0 means they are different. Okay, so the syntax here is you're going to have an integer return value. 0 means they're the same. Anything else, not the same. And you're going to set that equal to This is the first variable that you want to test, dot, compare to, and then you pass it the second variable. Okay, and again, this can be strings or objects. So in this example, because we haven't really worked as much with objects, I chose strings. So you can see I've got 4 different strings, and then I've got something that I call return value. And so I didn't want upper and lowercase are different. So if you do not make them all lowercase or all uppercase, it will detect those differences. So I actually took these strings and I converted them all to lowercase. So because I did not want it to be case sensitive. And then I take my first string and I compare it to my second one. Okay, so this is all lowercase and so is this, and they're comparing. If it is a 0, then they are the same. And if it's not a 0, then the strings are different. And that's basically what it says. And then I take the first string again and compare it to the third one. So I'm comparing this one and this one. And if it returns a 0, they're the same. Otherwise, they are not the same. And then finally, I'm comparing string 1 to string 4. Okay, and remember, they've been converted to lowercase. So this time it is going to return a 0, and it's going to print they are the same. Okay, and so you can kind of see how that worked. The equals method determines if 2 string objects have the same value. And so it's almost identical to compare to. The difference is it returns a Boolean, a true or a false, instead of a 0. So if you prefer the result to be a Boolean, then you should use equals instead of compare to. Otherwise, they kind of do the same thing. So what I did was I took that exact same program that we just looked at, and instead of an integer return value, I changed it to a Boolean. And then I had to change the if, and obviously I had to change the method call, right? Because I'm calling equals now instead of compare to. And I changed the if because I don't need to check to see if it's equal to 0. All I have to do is check to see if it's true. So I can just check the return value. Okay, so I changed the method call and I'm just checking the return value. Okay, and so as I mentioned, equals is almost identical to compare to. The difference is that one returns true or false, and the other one returns a 0 if it's true, and a value if it's false. Ends with and starts with. This lets you look in a string and check the beginning words or letters and the ending words or letters. Okay, and obviously ends with lets you check the ending words or letters. It starts with lets you check the starting words or letters. So the way you have to set this up is you have a string variable that you want to check. And so that little string variable goes first with a dot, and then you say ends with, and then you pass it the string that you want to check. You're saying, is this part of this larger string? So you can see I've got my first string called waterfalls, and I'm going to check to see if the WA is in there. Okay, and this is another one that is going to return a true or a false. So I've got string 1 dot ends with check string. If this is true, meaning that the waterfall string ends with WA, if that's true, then it's going to print out a message, that the string ends with the check string. If it's not, it prints out a different message. Okay, and we can all see that this should be false, right? Should not test true on that one. Starts with does something similar, okay? And you set it up similar. You have a string variable that starts with, and then you've got your check string that you're passing. The difference is, instead of looking at the end of the string or the letters that you're checking, it looks at the beginning. And again, it returns a Boolean. So you have an if statement and you're basically checking to see if it's true. You know, was this little check string at the beginning of our longer string? And it is true. So it's going to execute that first right line statement that indicates that, you know, the check string is there. Otherwise, it gives you the other message. So just for fun, I've got several different strings here. I've got kind of 3 phrases, random phrases, and then I've got a couple different check strings. String 4 and 5 are kind of my check strings. And so what I do is I convert everything to lowercase. And that eliminates any kind of case sensitivity. And then I take S1 and I see if it starts with S4. And then I take S1 and I see if it ends with S5. I do the same thing for S2. Does it start with S4? Does it end with S5? And I do the same thing for S3. And then if it's true, if any of these tests true, I print one message. If it's false, I print a different message. Okay, but it's just checking that check string against the longer string to see if it's either in the beginning or the end. It's null or white space. So this is very similar to is null or empty. The difference is a white space is something like this. Okay, it's the space bar. So this one is going to check to see if there's nothing there or if there's spaces. Okay, so if there's nothing there or there's spaces, it is going to return true. Okay, if something is there, then it's going to return false. And you can see I've got this in a if statement. So if it's true, then I'm printing that the string has white space or nothing. Otherwise, I'm printing that it is a valid string. And I'm doing that for each one. So you can see down here the output, waterfalls is valid. It detected that string 2 basically has nothing in it. So it says contains white space or nothing, and same with strings 3, which is a bunch of spaces. The math methods, they are part of the C# math class, and they basically let us perform math on numbers. And so the syntax is kind of the same for all of them. It's math with a capital M, which is the name of the class, dot whatever the method name is, and then in parentheses, you send it the parameters it is expecting. And it usually expects a number, either one number or 2 numbers. And so here are some of the math methods and what they do. So we got max, min, and max returns the largest of 2 numbers, min returns the smallest. We have square root, which only takes 1 number. Absolute, which returns the absolute value, which if the number is negative, it just converts it to positive. We have math round, where you send it a number and the number of decimal places you want it rounded to. Math.pow, where you can take the first value and raise it to the second. So if the first value is a 10 and the second value is 2, that would be 10 to the second power. Math floor rounds down. Okay, the floor is below you, so it runs down, or rounds down. That's how I remember it. Ceiling is above you. Math.ceil rounds up. And then div rem is one of the ways that you can get a remainder. Honestly, I think just using the modulus is simpler, but if you use this method, you have to send it the dividend, which is the number on top of the division. You have to send it the divisor, which is the bottom number in the division equation. And you have to send it a variable that you want the output stored in, which would be the actual remainder itself. So what I did in this little program is I grabbed a couple of random numbers, and I've got a menu that I display, and I put that in a method. And let's see, here's my method. And you can see there's 7 different options in the menu, which takes up some space, which is why I stuck it down in a method. So they're basically going to pick a number from the menu, and they're going to return that number. And that number gets returned here. And then we're going to check this. So you can see we're in a while loop, and we're going to stay in the loop as long as they don't pick a 7. We grab 2 random numbers between 1 and 100. And these are integers. For most of the math methods that we're going to play with, integers are fine, except for the rounding ones. So you can see here we've got, if the input is 1, we are calling math.max. If the input is 2, we are calling math.min. Input is 3 means we want to round. So I'm not going to be using the 2 integer numbers. I'm actually grabbing 2 double numbers that have decimals. So we actually have something to round. And then I am calling math.round, and I'm rounding each number to the 2nd decimal place. If they pick a 4, we are taking the first number and raising it to the 2nd power, which can actually give us, well, actually, we're taking the first number, raising it to the 2nd power, taking the 2nd number, raising it to the 3rd power. Okay, and the reason I didn't take the first number and raise it to the 2nd is because that would give us some really strange results. So I wanted this to make more sense to you guys. So we take the first number, raise it to the 2nd, 2nd number, raise it to the 3rd. Then the 5th one, we are using div rem. So you can see how to use this function. So you'll see I had to declare these as int32 because that is what div rem wants. And I've declared remainder. The dividend I set to n1, which was the random number. And the divisor I set to 2. Okay, and then I created a little Boolean called success. And you can see that I pass div rem, the dividend, the divisor, and the remainder. I'm checking the remainder, and I'm basically determining if it's even or odd. Okay, because if you divide by 2 and the remainder is 0, you got an even number. Otherwise, it's odd. And if they didn't choose any of these options, then we are going to assume they want the square root. So we do the square root of each of those numbers, and then we display the input menu again. Okay, and here's a little sample run so you can kind of see how that looks. Now, personally, if I want to find the remainder from integer division, I would probably use the modulus just because it's super simple. And to use the modulus, basically, instead of using the slash, which is the division operator, you just, between the 2 numbers, you use the modulus. And if the result is 0, that means there is no remainder. And if you have a value, that is the leftover portion. So for example, if you did, let's say 16 modulus 5. Okay, so 5 goes in there 3 times, but there's 1 left over. So that is the remainder. That is what you would see for the remainder. Okay, and so here you can see I ran this, got some random numbers. 5 goes into 50 evenly, so the remainder is 0, but the rest do have a remainder with this. So you can use div rem to do remainders, or you can use the modulus. I think the modulus is easier, but I did want to show you both options.